late, but I do suggest we still start. We've got 30 participants at the moment, which is already a good number. My name is Katrin, and I'm going to be the facilitator today, at least the, say, technical facilitator. I hand over to Suhail, who's going to introduce our speaker for the welcome remarks. Suhail, please.
Yes, good afternoon from Germany in this very case. Suhail Al-Janabi, I'm the co-manager of the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, and I have the pleasure to announce as a welcome speaker Leah Vanambwe from the African Union Commission, from the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment. And the AUC was also co-host of this very workshop and dialogue we are reporting on. So Leah, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, colleagues. So my name is Leah, as introduced, and I'm happy to welcome you all to today's webinar, which will be reflecting on the outcomes of the first Africa Science Policy Dialogue on DSI. A key issue on this is actually on the fact that this is where policy meets science, or is it vice versa? As we know, to get good policies, at least from the African Union Commission, it's always good to start with that. It's always too good to have a foundation on science. Based on the outcomes from this last session, or the first meeting, which was held in Nairobi, we were not able to participate in person due to the budget sessions which were going on at the African Union at the time. But we did get the feedback, and we were happy that the meeting did take place, and hope that it's not the last one, and that a series of more webinars will be coming in, especially as this particular topic is one of the areas that we've identified as gaps for the country. So of course, the issue of coordination comes in, and here there are different levels of coordination, either at the continental level or the regional levels, and also within the national levels. And of course, for issues like coordination, there is need for means of implementation in terms of financing, either is it for participants to be able to get to the venues, or to be able to have large delegations, or even to be able to go for training sessions on the same. Of course, I hope that as we continue to have these sessions, we will be continuing to build a database, which will have the list of experts that maybe countries can call to get guidance or advice. So hopefully that we are hoping that at least in the Nairobi session, colleagues were able to make the networks that were necessary to be able to reach out to each other, because of course some countries are more advanced than others, and that is normal. We have different countries prioritize different aspects when it comes to biodiversity. Of course, there's also the issue which was raised on the political support, and I believe the team there, the ABS Capacity Building Initiative, has been over the past years really doing their best to ensure that the political leadership is informed of the process and to get the political buy-in. And slowly, we hope that this will now reach the attention of our heads of states, or at the ministerial level. So we're looking forward to the next steps. And the key milestones, of course, include ministerial meetings which are upcoming, like the AMSEN session, the AU-SDC meetings, etc. Of course, capacity is key. Capacity building for existing staff, but also continuous learning as things change. Science changes and policies change along the way. So with those few remarks, just to reaffirm our commitment to continue to support this process, to work together, ensure that there's a continued engagement. And as I said, of course, we are very grateful to the work that is already ongoing, and hope that we'll be able to support it more. With those few remarks, thank you again for inviting us.
Thank you very much, Leah. And I will now introduce everyone to the agenda of this webinar. So this is our agenda for today. We've got 2 hours, and they're basically split into 1 and 1 hour. In the beginning, we're going to have 4 inputs, because this is a reflection webinar of the African Policy Science Dialogue that was held in Nairobi in April. And so Suhail Al-Janabi from the initiative will say a little bit about the rationale, the objectives, and how this dialogue went. Then we have two actual more technical inputs. Hartmut Meyer, all of them from the initiative, will speak about the creation and use of DSI in research and development. And we'll hear something from Pierre Duplessis about DSI from a scientific and policy angles. And then Andreas Drees is going to show a summary of the recommendations that came out of the dialogue, so that you've all got a solid knowledge of what happened there. And then we have a reflection on all this. And we'll start off with a panel of 4 people who have actually participated in Nairobi: Jessica da Silva, Mariam Bouhadida, Mpatso Kalemba, and Osama Abdel Karawi, who will all be introduced in more detail later on. And Pierre Duplessis is going to facilitate that panel, and you will be able to ask questions or make comments that will be discussed by the panel then as on the second part of the panel. I will not say much more, but hand directly over to Suhail, who is going to give the first input on the program and the rationale of the first African Science Policy Dialogue on DSI. Suhail, please.
Yes, and so once again, hello. Indeed, as you rightly said, it was the first African Science Policy Dialogue. It was planned for a long time. Of course, also COVID here had its impact, so that it wasn't able to be conducted then earlier in 2022 as we have initially planned, and it emerged basically from the request on the one hand of African scientists to better understand what the international negotiations on DSI are about, what possible impacts it could have on their work, being then also dependent on access to data, to digital sequence information. So on the one hand, the curiosity and the need for information on the ongoing negotiations from the scientific side, but even more on the other hand, from the African negotiators and from policymakers, to know what African realities in science are. So which databases are being used, how are they used, what are the procedures, and so on. In this regard, we then, together with the African Union Commission, as we heard, and ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi, we then were able to get together with some 40 participants from different African countries, more or less half-half negotiators and scientists from very different disciplines, so livestock, taxonomy, but also pharmacology and other disciplines, to discuss the following. And now let me briefly walk you through the agenda so that you get a background on what has happened. So very nice white colors, so you can see that there was indeed also a quite practical element within the workshop in Nairobi itself. So the first day was dedicated to the broader global developments and to provide also technical introduction, what's at stake, and that was done from both ends. So what is it that scientists should need to know about the political process on the one hand, and also what is it that the policymakers should know about key features of the utilization of DSI in Africa. That was then followed by a laboratory visit, very hands-on, blood banks, how are viruses being stored, what were the sequencing applications, and then also visits to the biobank, and that then emerged into a first dialogue between the scientists and the negotiators on what is or what was unclear still at the other end. Of course, we had a very nice reception and dinner, and then went into day 2. There you can see that we much more did dive into details. So this was now to present what was at stake at the last COP15. What are the internationally agreed criteria for a future multilateral benefit sharing mechanism? We had then also a panel discussion with scientists on what they would assume as favorable practices, but also as killer criteria for their work with respect to governance and management of data, of digital sequence information. Then a very practical discussion on also reality in science, that you deal with very different databases that have different terms and conditions for access, for utilization, and so on. So how could that look like in a future world under one roof of a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism? It was also then a very lively discussion on the mutual supportive implementation of various ABS instruments, because as you know, the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources, Food and Agriculture, WHO, and also BBNJ, they are all establishing or have established instruments for the utilization and benefit sharing with respect to digital sequence information. And then, of course, we got a more depth insight and what were the current options on the table at the CBD by Mpatso. And then, of course, one key element besides the monetary benefit sharing aspect is how non-monetary benefit sharing in a multilateral approach, because we're coming out from a bilateral approach, could look like in future. And then at day 3, it was then that we looked, okay, from the different perspectives, science and policy, where are fields that where the same mindset appeared, where were divergences, and then quite importantly, the session DSI data and information. This was something that we put as ad hoc feature into the program because we were requested by a couple of negotiators to provide really more hands-on information and examples on how the international databases function, how is the INSDC network being set up, and how does for example, this question of open access, how does that play out in practice? So some of these data banks were then accessed in a live session and underpinned with real life experiences from African scientists and the taxonomy and the agricultural realm. Then on the way, on the concluding stretch, if you so wish, there was then the reflection on key open questions. So what is still then marked with a question mark in the different UN fora, and then a quite important session then at the end of the day, seeing all this work and all the construction sites, if you so wish, what would be the priorities now to tackle? And there was a brainstorming and a recommendation session on that. And I think this will also be a part of a later session in this webinar to get back to the recommendations. So I hope that helped you to get a little bit of insights, what was discussed and how it was discussed. And now back to Katrin.
Yes, thank you very much, Suhel. You've already summarized what you've done, so I'll just move on. So I invite Hartmut Meyer to tell us something about the creation and use of DSI in R&D, open and access and benefit sharing options.
Thank you. I'm here. Well, I'm Hartmut Meyer from the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, also present at the workshop, and we gave a short input on what we call the two different worlds of DSI. One, of course, is creation of DSI out of the genetic resource and the use, and then the large area we are actually talking and negotiating about is access of DSI in data banks. So we, of course, we start with genetic resources which are accessed and sampled, and we know where we are going to do that because we might travel to that country. Then we, depending on the framework of that country, that has an ABS framework agreement, the so-called PIC is concluded, and the ABS contract, the match is made, which, amongst others, specifies the condition of research, so the condition of use, and also the various benefit sharing conditions. And of course, during the research you do with this genetic resource, benefits accrue, and the research can also, of course, include the analysis of DNA, RNA, the nucleic acids, and of proteins, and actually these proteins and nucleic acids can be sequenced. So a sequence information is created in that, and whatever you do with the secret information in the context of the contract then will be subject to benefit sharing. But usually in usual research project, this information is uploaded to international data banks, where first of all the contract cannot be uploaded, and of course it wouldn't also make a lot of sense because the contract of course is between the first user and the provider, and any further user of the data bank wouldn't be obliged or bound by that contract. And most of the DSI, which is currently in data, don't have country tags. So we don't know about the genetic resource where it came from. Meanwhile, these data tags are mandatory, so the newer entries of DSI have to be equipped with a country tag, so where the DSI came from. Now, with that, I'd like to introduce into this second world of DSI, the multilateral world, which how we call it. So these data banks have usually an open access policy, meaning that everybody with an internet connection can go into the data bank and download sequences, use these sequences in research and development. Also, new sequences can be created using modern technologies or artificial intelligence whatsoever. And also these new sequences which don't come from genetic resources directly, and then also can be again uploaded in the data. And another feature which is a general feature of this kind of access and use is that in many cases the user uses many accessions, hundreds of thousands or even more in one go, and also to achieve results for the research. So then based on these sequence information, which are now accessed decoupled from the genetic resource, also research can be done. We know we have cases of non-commercial research and of commercial research, and all this research will deliver some sort of benefit. But, and this is why all these negotiations on the DSI benefit sharing system from data banks was initiated. There is no benefit sharing because this use takes place outside of this contract, maybe contract, and the benefits will not be shared with anybody, whatever this could be. So then we have, and now with colors, we have these two different birds. One is the generation and use of DSI, which could take place under ABS contract, where benefit sharing then could go back to the country of origin. And on the right side, you see this multilateral world of DSI, where DSI acts like in data banks without any connection to the original countries and no benefit sharing up to now. And the last element of this presentation is referring to the recent decisions in the agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions and the CBD, that a benefit sharing system, a multilateral benefit sharing system, shall be created that covers exactly the use of DSI access and data. So this is something we recommend to look at and to study, to understand these two different concepts of the use of DSA and the systems of benefit sharing, which we might have in the future. Well, and then during the workshop, we had a lot of discussion. So what is open access and how does this work? And we had, of course, many participants who never entered these data banks and who had actually no concrete idea what it is all about. And for that, we just had a quick exercise, just searching in a data bank for nucleotides. And because we were in Africa and Kenya, so we searched for elephant sequences, and we tried to find out, do we find sequences from Kenya? And then we looked into the sequence, and then we also did a little use of DSI. We compared the sequences with others. So if you just unshare, I will go to my own browser and go into this little exercise, which I think was quite interesting also for many participants who were not proficient in this use. So this is the famous gene bank data bank, a part of the International Nucleotide Sequence Database Collection, the INSEC, which consists of 3 data banks, this one in the US, and one in Europe, and one in Japan, which are updated daily, so which essentially present the same information. And here we use the nucleotide collection. They have different data banks, and we type in the scientific name of the elephant in Africa, and then we just see that, look, we have indeed 76,000 entries on nucleotide sequences from elephants, probably all over the world. We can type in now Kenya. So now we can see those entries in which researchers who uploaded these sequences also mentioned that they came from Kenya. And indeed, we are with 2,868 entries where elephant nucleotide sequences from Kenya were uploaded. And just to show you how it looked, I go to the first one here. It comes from Narok County, a specific part of Kenya. We click on it, and this is how this entry looked like. So it has a fixed set of information. So it is from animal. We can find some taxonomic information about the specific genetic resource. So it has 599 bases are uploaded. The sequence here are the authors. This is the methodology, and here we find the scientific journal in which these results were published. And also these data banks usually give a link to that publication. So you can see this is the publication that in the end screened a lot of different animals to find out, to develop a methodology for detection of meat and illegally traded wildlife products, as it says. So, and in the end, even that's not always the case. You can here You can even get the free full text version of that publication and download and read it. That is the services on data and here on information which these data banks provide, amongst others. And if we just go back, let me just. We can also do a very quick search, and this is just for demonstration, not for scientific reason. So if I can click here, so this is the sequence itself, which was determined. Now we just imagine in our laboratory, we would have established a certain gene sequence, maybe like this one, which I mark, and we actually don't know from which gene this is. So we could go to this data bank and run a blast analysis. So we would copy our gene sequence into this field here. And then we would run an analysis. So then the data bank would compare our gene sequence with all the millions of gene sequences which are inside, and then will show us the nearest hits. So we need to now doing a bit of calculation amongst this vast amount of data which is stored. And then we have a result. So we have 100 sequences which were selected from all, which are very, very identical or close identical to the one we found in our laboratory. And of course, no surprise, this is all from elephants. So our sequence is 100% identical to other elephant sequences from this gene, from the mitochondria, or very, very closely related. 60, 98%. This is the sequences from the Asian elephant. And you can even see here a lot of mammoth gene sequences are also in this data bank. So this is a very, very quick and rough demonstration. Now we used DSI. Now we use the DSI, which is stored in the data bank, to identify the sequence we got from our laboratory work. So now we know that this sequence is part of the mitochondrial genome. So with that, I think it's a very quick go through this data bank, and this is what the researchers name as open access. So you actually, everybody who has an internet connection can access this. And of course, I'm not a researcher, so I just got some information what to do. You can do a lot of different analysis now with these data you can use for your science. And of course, you can also develop commercial applications out of the results which you get from research. Okay, so I think that's the short demonstration of how these data banks work. And we can go back to the presentation. Yes, and then apart from that, we had also from Jessica a brief introduction into her work, which is taxonomy work. And I just picked one slide. And so one of the examples she presented is that, of course, you have like say museum records or also gene bank records of DNA from these geckos, from different gecko species. And when they revisited all that, they found out, and this is what you can see in the red box, that several specimens which were classified as the Latirostris species actually were not from that species, but from the Americansis species. So that was one of her examples how these gene data can be used in taxonomy. And the next slide, that was more applied example from Miriam, from Tunisia, from plant breeding, where certain bees were analyzed on their ability to resist pathogens. So then it was discovered that obviously a certain gene was either switched on or off, and that gene was involved in the pathogen response, so somehow connected to the resistance. And then, of course, with all these data you have from the data banks of expression of the specific genes, you then can detect whether either the genes are present or not present in your varieties, or if they are active or not active. You know, so that was a very hands-on example on how you use all these data and a lot of sequences, many more than I just showed in plant breeding. So with that, I think we could also demonstrate very practical uses of DSI at that workshop. But yes, thank you.
Very much, Hartmut. And so we're ready for the next step and to hear from Pierre about the DSI from scientific and policy angles.
Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon, everyone. So this presentation was done on the first day, is basically just to kind of set the scene for the discussion. And it was split into two parts. The first one looked at some scientific considerations of the whole DSI debate, and the second one at some of the policy angles that need to be considered. and I started by doing the two worlds of DSI that Hartmut has just presented. And then one of the most important things to realize about genetics is that it's a comparative science, right? That you need to compare the genome of one organism to that of others to be able, and to the background data, to be able to identify useful things from the data. I mean, a piece of genetic code is only meaningful in the context of all of the rest of the genetics. So the implication of that is that the bigger and the more detailed the background data set is that is freely available, the more useful it becomes for everyone who's involved in the science. So yes, it's true that there can be individual sequences that are, that code for particularly valuable mutations. But to know about those, you need to compare them with thousands of other sequences. And because there's so many sequences and there's so many sequences being uploaded every day now, tracking and tracing of all of those sequences and their origins and how they're being used all around the world is very difficult and impractical. And there's been a very clear message from scientists that they want to minimize or preferably eliminate administrative burdens and red tape that's associated with accessing DSI, which is completely understandable if you're a scientist working with this information, trying to solve problems in the real world, like taxonomy, like plant to animal breeding, like health. You don't want to spend your time like trying to fill in forms about where did you find the data, etc. And at the same time, there's also, in terms of the existing instruments and the foundational instrument, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity itself, there's no real legal basis for or realistic prospects of controlling or restricting access to sequences that are already publicly available. And that, of course, formed the basis of the agreement that we made in Montreal to create a multilateral system of benefit sharing for the use of DSI. But this does not mean that when a country grants prior-informed consent and negotiates mutually agreed terms on genetic resources that are newly accessed in its jurisdiction, that it can't, in those mutually agreed terms, include provisions for keeping that information confidential, either for a limited period or, maybe forever, or treat that as proprietary national information. And this is actually common practice in the private sector, right? I mean, the private sector do not share their databases with the world. They use the open access to find the value, and then they use that for development. So we have this current situation of the open access, and we have the possibility of controlling some parts of the new sequences that become available. But it's very important that we understand how the current system works. So we have the International Nucleotide Sequence Database collaboration, and it has 3 databases. One of them is in the US, one of them is in Europe, and one of them is in Japan. And they are connected. Each of them has search tools, workspaces, external sources, analysis tools included in them. And so scientists would typically work in various areas of this overall architecture. Maintaining that infrastructure costs about $50 million a year. That funding is provided by the governments of the countries that host these databases. Every day they take complete copies of each other. And so anything that's uploaded to any one of them is available on the other two databases within 24 hours. It's free to all users. You don't have to register to get access to this information. But maybe most importantly, the one that's in the US is not in the CBD, because the CBD is, the US is not a party to the CBD. The implication of that is that anything that is done around access to these databases in the CBD will not be applicable to the leg that is in the US, and will not, in fact, protect anything that is in the three databases in the overall ecosystem. So just to give you, to be very clear about the fact, that in 2002, when the INSDC was created, it was very clear about the fact that open access is a foundational principle. And this access policy, by implication, has been inherited by all the downstream databases that use, the core infrastructure. So the key points there is free and unrestricted access to all of the data. They will not attach statements of records that restrict access to the data. So they will not say, for example, that this data was obtained under an ABS permit with Uganda. They specifically exclude doing that. They will also not say that they will not record any proprietary interest in it. They will say this comes from a patent, but it's up to the user to then find out whether their use of that data would contravene the patent. They will also have no use restrictions or licensing requirements in any of their data records. The database records that are submitted to the INSDC will remain permanently accessible as part of the scientific record, and information displayed on the website is fully disclosed to the public. Right? So there is this long and strong and current access and use policy, which basically precludes controlling access to the information in these databases. So why would scientists want to put their data into public databases where anyone can see it and use it? Well, for starters, because, as I've already said, to do genomics, you need to be able to do comparison. The sequence, sequence doesn't mean anything until you can do a search and find out what else is similar to that, where else does it occur, what functionality has been ascribed to that, etc. It's also a policy for academic journals that they will not publish papers unless the data is openly available. And this is for reasons of scientific reproducibility, so that other researchers can test that data and make sure that the conclusions drawn from the research are valid. There's also, most funding agencies will require that the data is deposited in open access database as part of their public mandate to support research. And then there's the question of scientific ethics, which, reproducibility, integrity, data security. So that is why, even if there are if a country brings in restrictions on the availability of open access data, it will just really be making it almost impossible for its own national scientists to do this kind of research. It's interesting to realize that most of the time scientists from the different regions in the world, which is what this graph shows, work on sequence data from their own region. I mean, they also use sequence data from other regions because, the national boundary, so biodiversity doesn't really recognize those national boundaries. So in Africa, African scientists use mainly DSI that comes from Africa. But to make sense of that DSI, they still need to have access to the data from other parts of the world. And at the moment, Africa has the lowest number of scientific publications in this area of all the regions. So there's an inherent value in having access to the rest of the data to add value to your national data that you create or the regional African data that you're interested in studying. So yeah, this is a description of how these different aspects of biology are interrelated and integrated and cross-talk to each other. So the open integrated digital sequence information enables scientists to understand how biology works, and this understanding leads to more benefits, right? Because there are many different entry points into this tangled maze, but the more connected the records are, the bigger the insights that you can gain from looking at the sequence information. Apart from the three INSDC databases, there's also another 50 databases roundabout. I mean, the number keeps increasing of core global biodata resources. And then there's like secondary databases that are much more specialized in a particular set of subset of biodiversity. So about 850 of theirs. And then there's like secondary databases that are not primarily focused on DSI, but on other kinds of data. So there's a very large degree of dependence in the science of this on that core resource of the free INSDC databases, like 99% interconnected from the secondary databases. The databases are paid for by public funding, as I've already said, and it's used by academia and industry. So it's used for non-commercial purposes, but also for research into areas that might have commercial outcomes. But industry just downloads the whole set over an FTP server and then keeps its own information in-house, and because it's worried about being about spying. This is a demonstration of that, the complexity of that integration. And you know, this happens nowadays with machine learning and so on, automatically across a huge number of databases. This is only 19 out of thousands, and you can see how complicated it gets already. And on top of that, there's also now a completely artificial manufacturing, basically, of proteins that are designed by artificial intelligence. So additionally need to consider that scientists are willing to share their sequences, but they want credit for that. They have support needs, capacity development needs, which includes access to sequencing equipment, to consumables, to data connections, to more storage. There's a long list of that. And as the technology evolves, those needs for support evolve. But one thing that's always important is that scientists need to have opportunities for collaborative research and networks and partnerships, because that's an important part of becoming good at this work. Right, so let's move on to the policy considerations. I think it's important to realize that, like many other aspects of life, DSI is a result of the computer explosion. We all know how much that has changed our lives. And it has, in a way, changed the world of access and benefit sharing, which was originally based on this idea that countries have permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. And that's what gave us the third objective of the CBD, of fair and equitable sharing of benefits, which would be a driver of sustainable use and lead to conservation. But that hasn't really worked. So this idea that access and benefit sharing is a pair and that they work through pick and mat, there's simply too much free access available in the world in ex situ collections and in other sources of, other topics to research for this to have worked. But Africa has always brought this issue that, we need to share the benefits, not just from the new access that occurs, but also from the ongoing access that has already happened. And one of the outcomes we've got for that is that we now have an agreement to create a multilateral mechanism for sharing the benefits of DSI. This law is basically about not relying on sovereign rights over genetic resources in trying to replicate that in digital sequence information, and the need to come to a compromise in international collaborations if we are going to get benefit sharing from the use of DSI. This is inherent to the nature of DSI. How it's distributed, how it's created, stored, accessed, limits what you can do as a single country. And therefore, open access was key to the agreement that was made in Montreal, which basically is about decoupling access to DSI from benefit sharing, or sharing the benefits arising from the use of DSI. It's also, in the African context, really important to bear in mind that DSI opens up opportunities for Africa to address not only our Development Agenda 2063 goals and priorities, but also some of our perennial other priorities like resource mobilization, capacity development, and technology transfer. And in doing so, policymakers have to consider the impacts of DSI on traditional knowledge and on farmers' rights. You know, Africa's strength in international negotiations is its unity and its coordination. But in this particular area, there's at the moment a lack of coordination between the negotiating teams in various international fora, and that is something that we really need to address. And to doing that would help to have a better understanding of the scientific considerations that are shared across sectors that use DSI, would help policymakers and negotiators to achieve better outcomes at the negotiation level, but also at the implementation level. We then did a brief overview of what's happening in the various international fora. I think the most important one to concentrate on here, because we have to do that by October, is to develop this multilateral mechanism under the CBD, where the main point of contention is to how far can you go with decoupling access from benefit sharing. At the World Health Organization and the Food and Agricultural Organization, and also at the BBNJ treaty, things are not that far advanced yet. And with WHO, the discussions now around that have been moved and will continue next year. So the focus really at the moment is very tightly on the COP16 in October. Africa has made a proposal in that negotiations that a 1% charge on all products of biodiversity, so not just the DSI or DSI products, would be a way to resolve this and mobilize a significant amount of money for biodiversity. And it is really at the moment only, in my view, the only proposal on the table that has a chance of solving a part of the biodiversity problem. So we can use DSI as a stepping stone towards a wider objective, which is to secure large amount of benefit sharing to support biodiversity conservation. This proposal can also be implemented in alongside other more sectoral solutions. We'll see how that works out. And we do need to come up with creative solutions for traditional knowledge, non-monetary benefit sharing, capacity development, and technology transfer. But we need to be united in our approach to this if we wanted to succeed. And we should continue to, or we should improve also on the extent to which policy supports science and science-informed policy. Yeah, this is just a reference which Charlotte's already dealt with to all of the other things we discussed in Nairobi, the 9+1 criteria for DSI in the COP decision, the more detailed information about the negotiations in other fora, and how that could or support or hinder mutually supportive implementation. And then we also had like a very detailed presentation on the discussions in the CBD. But that's far too much for this webinar. So please look at the report of the workshop, which was linked in the invitation that you received for this webinar, for more detailed information on that if you're interested. All right, that's the end of mine. Sorry, I took a little bit longer than anticipated, but there we are. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Pierre. a lot of information in a very short time, but as Pierre said, you can read the workshop report and find all the information there. So then let's just move on to our last presentation before we come to the panel, and that is looking at basically at the outcomes, the recommendations from the dialogue. And here I invite Andreas Streves to please turn on your camera and speak to us.
Camera is on, sound as well, and thank you very much for handing it over to me to give a short summary of the recommendations which came out of the dialogue. I promise it will not be as long as the presentations before. A few words on how we came up, or the workshop came up, the participants came up with the recommendations. It was a group work to address what should be done, what could be done by the African national governments, by the Pan-African institutions and African negotiators for making progress on the road to a functional multilateral DSI benefit sharing system. Participants worked in 4 groups on the different topics, and all the groups worked on all the topics in an interchanging format, and the outcomes were then discussed in plenary, and to clarify issues, points where maybe some additional aspects had to be considered. And in the last step, then participants were asked to prioritize the key recommendations which were on the board, that are the red dots you see here on the pictures. On the picture, and of course the 4th board, it was addressing how to take the African policy science dialogue forward, proposals, ideas, what would be useful for the further process besides the stakeholders, the African national governments, the Pan-African institutions, and the African negotiators. Key recommendations addressed the political and technical leadership through the EU Commission and the African Minister Conference for the Environment, asking for there should be better coordination of the African group of negotiators, specifically regarding appropriate timelines to organize common positions. It was perceived that there could be and there should be improvement to facilitate the work of the African group of negotiators by the EU Commission. And AMCEN would be useful and should support the national governments, or call on the national governments to support the African proposal at COP16 for the multilateral mechanism and the fund for benefit sharing from the use of DSI, that were seen as key points for at the political and technical leadership. Participants also or quite a lot of recommendations came out, making it clear that dialogue is essential, and to continue the dialogue in the future. And national governments, they called for the national governments to establish and provide finance for national dialogues, so not to have only dialogue at the regional level or even at global levels, but also to engage in a dialogue at national level between the relevant sectors, such as biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, agriculture, fisheries, science policy, IPR policy, especially regarding regarding traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources and linked to DSI through that. And also health policy could be mentioned here. And at the Pan-African level, the relevant institutions involved in the coordination processes in the international negotiation, international negotiations under the CBD, FAO, WHO, and so on, should coordinate and ensure consistency in the African negotiation positions in the different fora, and of course also not only in the negotiations but also support subsequent national implementation, which I think is also reflected to quite some extent in the African biodiversity strategy. Yes, the third complex, or the third area of key recommendations addressed the need to mobilize funding. The Pan-African institutions should mobilize funding for substantive coordination during the negotiation processes under the relevant international fora, and of course mobilize funding for the subsequent support of implementation of the resulting decisions. And also there's a call to national governments to mobilize funding for the delegations to ensure that the delegations are big enough to be represented in the various parallel negotiation processes at the CBD COP, but I would assume also not only under the CBD COP, but also in the other fora. There's always a lot going on in parallel, and 1 or 2 person delegations are really not in the position to attend to all these different processes and bring in the respective positions of the countries. Here you see the detail of the recommendations who were prioritized by the participants. Each participant had 3 dots to put on the different specific recommendations. And you see here in addressing the African national governments, political buy-in and finance for the DSI dialogues in Africa at national level is among the key highest ranked recommendations, and also the call to support the African proposals for COP16. Funding is addressed, and the other recommendations down there are more addressing the implementation when DSI fund, for example, is really operative and functioning, and yes, to identify the stakeholders, raise awareness for the policymakers, which is, I think, one of the purposes of these dialogues, and provide funds and resources for capacity building. At the Pan-African level, for the Pan-African institutions, very strong prioritized recommendation was to provide leadership in the negotiations, mobilize funding, foster dialogue between the African institutions. So you see here all the details. The further recommendations address again more technical aspects to have proper programs, databases, and promote experience sharing on DSI, and addressing the negotiators. Also better coordination, timelines to organize the common positions with some less prioritizations, and also to take into account the African development priorities, the Agenda 2063, but still it has been prioritized by quite a number of people. Consultation with scientists, mentorship of upcoming negotiators, and so on. So I think there's quite a lot of recommendations to work together and to ensure consistency in the negotiation positions, with people coming in new and elder negotiators getting going into retirement to overcome these hurdles. How to take the dialogue forward? There is a strong request for further meetings to follow up with that, and of course to raise and mobilize the funding for the continuation of these dialogue processes at the African but also at national level. Reporting, making information and documents available. Again, the dialogue process there should be leadership for the Pan-African level. And the purpose of this of the dialogues, of course, should be, there was quite some recommendations in that regard, to raise awareness, to improve the understanding on how and for which purposes DSI is generated and used, to build the common ground and to increase the understanding between the providers and users, and to make policymakers across the relevant government departments, so not only in the environment sector or in the health sector negotiating in their silos, but also to get to common positions and common understanding between the different government departments. With that, I'm through and hand back to Katrin for the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So I think now everybody has a good overview of what happened in Nairobi. And we're ready to go for the panel discussion to discuss, so basically to reflect on the outcomes and on what happened, but especially, of course, the outcomes and how to take this process further.
Thank you very much, Katrin. And thank you for agreeing to be part of this panel, all of you. I'm going to just a quick introduction. Mphatso Kalemba, she's the head of the Biodiversity Division at the Environmental Affairs Department in Malawi and the national focal point of A4ABS. She's represented Malawi at various CBD and UNEA meetings, and she's now the co-chair of the ad hoc open-ended working group on DSI and its informal advisory group. She has a master's degree in environmental governance and has also worked as a scientific officer at the National Research Council of Malawi. Professor Osama Abdelkawi has a PhD in microbiology and immunology, and he's currently a pharmaceutical sciences professor at the Egyptian Atomic Energy Authority, specializing in drug design and genetic engineering research. He's also the ABS and biosafety focal point at the Ministry of Environment in Egypt. Dr. Jessica Da Silva is the principal scientist at the South African National Biodiversity Institute and the genetics lead for South Africa's National Biodiversity Assessment. Her work focuses on integrating evolutionary genomics into wildlife management and on genetic diversity indicators in the global monitoring framework. She's also the editor of the African Journal of Herpetology and an active member of several international groups or committees involved in better recognizing, translating, and using genetic data. Dr. Christian Diambo, last but not least, is a scientist at the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health at the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, where he leads the Cellular Resources Functional Genomics and Biotechnology program. His focus is on livestock reproductive technologies and precision breeding and on biobanking management using stem cell technology. He's also ILRI's Nagoya Protocol and CBD focal point and has extensive experience with capacity building and higher education at numerous universities in Africa where he still plays research, advisory, and supervision roles. So a lot of experience in here. I think one of the interesting things for me at the Science Policy Dialogue was to realize how many of the negotiators are actually, in fact, also scientists. But it's not about what I took away, it's about what you learned at this at the dialogue. And so for our first round of the panel, I would ask each of you to have to just briefly give us your main impressions and the key takeaways from the meeting. And if you can in the process also capture things that were particularly important to your research sector, that would be great. We'll start ladies first. We'll go with Mphatso and then Jessica, then Christian and Osama will have the last word in this first round. Mphatso, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre, and also happy to be the first to respond. In terms of the major takeaways for me at the science policy dialogue that we had, which I found very, very important, I'll just mention two. I think the most important one is how it's very important that we should be having these dialogues. Because I think personally I have been involved in the policy making component of the processes. Sometimes we forget to bring in the needs of the science community in the policies that we are making. Sometimes we forget to think through how would the policies we are making impact the scientific communities. So one of the biggest takeaway for me was how important it is that we continue engaging the science and policy so that the needs and the we understand the different processes, we understand the different implications that the policies we make would, how they would impact the scientific processes, and as well as their operations, because we learned a lot about what is happening in the scientific world and how the policies we make would eventually impact or implicate some of those processes. So that was one in terms of the takeaway. And I think this is an area that we need to strengthen. The second takeaway for me, I think it's in line with the presentation that Andreas just made on the need for the Pan-African processes that allow that continuous dialogue to happen. So we need to have that process at the African level that allows that dialogue to happen, that allows us to come together and create platforms for thinking through the capacities that we need and the type of resources that we need and how we can work together. So major points for me, the process that we need, but also the importance of continuing with the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mpatso. Yes, looking forward. Jessica, what were your main messages and takeaways, impressions?
Going to the workshop, I really wasn't sure what to expect. The whole policy side of DSI has been generally overwhelming, and I've just been there to listen. So I was very eager to listen to the various perspectives from the different sectors and policymakers. And DSI is made up of so many different elements, as is ABS, with the various stakeholders that need to be considered. So a single simple solution and way of thinking would have been maybe too much to expect. But just how different the perspectives can be and are was very interesting to me, and not in a negative, we're going nowhere kind of way, but in a we need to all listen and communicate and share our experiences to get a better understanding of the differences and similarities amongst everyone. So we need more dialogue, and that was very evident for me. What seemed very clear and well-defined to me, for example, was not clear or had a different view for other people, like open access or the differences between data and information. But one thing that I felt was shared was that the benefits most definitely needed to be, the benefits of DSI needed to be a key aspect. This seemed to be what unified everyone, I think. And I believe the vast majority, if not all, really showed support for the African proposal, even though this wasn't really discussed or highlighted in any way, but there was generally some support. What also really stood out to me was that those involved in the heart of these negotiations need support at all levels, not only to make informed decisions, which they were really hard to do, and as you just mentioned, many of them are scientists themselves, but also to simply have staying power and impact so that the African views and opinions can really be heard loudly. And something I feel very strongly about is that Africa needs to generate more DSI. So we need to find a way of doing this that really benefits us all, within the spirit of compromise, of course, but we definitely need more.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Christian, what did you, on your home turf, observe and remark?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you, everyone. So as the title said, it was the first dialogue and a wonderful one. So the first thing is to thank the organizers and the facilitators and the participants also for their engagement during this meeting that really brought together policymakers and scientists, and most importantly, to show how science is done even on the continent and demonstrate to policymakers how we are really working on the science aspect to support the development in the domain of genetic resources. And one of the key things that came out from there was also is that the community present in the room recognized the call for political and technical leadership, be it at the national and Pan-African level, to be able to support the African group of negotiators to be sure that whatever we are doing is really for the benefit also of the research of the continent, etc. And I think during the panel session during the meeting, Jessica mentioned the need for simplicity and open access, to keep it very simple and very understandable, and that to be done while not neglecting the sovereignty of and the right of countries or indigenous people and local community, etc. And most importantly, to be consistent in the open and access without hindering research and development. So these were really key things that was important, and the excitement that we have from policymakers to be in the lab and to see exactly why we are talking about DSI and open access and multilateral system. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Osama, you're the most experienced of my panelists, been in this process almost as long as I have. And you have the energy of a young man, which I no longer have. So what were your impressions and takeaways?
Well, two important things. First one is that everybody called for open access, but nobody understand what people get from open access. And to cover that, digital sequence information encompasses a wide range of data derived from genetic sequence. It includes not only the raw sequence data, but also various form processed, annotated, and interpreted data. And in fact, traditional knowledge is part of DSI, being metadata and contextual information related to genetic resource. This is some of the things that nobody understands. Actually, traditional knowledge is DSI because it's contextual. If you look at what you can get from those open access sequence, it's not just the nucleotide DNA or RNA sequence, the protein sequence, but also a lot of other issues like structural genomic, what are the three-dimensional structure, comparative genomic, the phylogenetic data, the homology data, where you can identify conserved sequence, synthetic sequence that are designed in the laboratory and often used to create new biological part, device system, environmental eDNA, metagenomics, gene expression, functional genomics, genomic annotation, like knowing the location, structure, function, and annotated promoter, enhancer, silencer. A lot of things are already there. And if you just think that putting sequence there is good, you are losing a lot of money and a lot of resources. So that's why I fully support the African position of linking it to all biodiversity product, because sometimes it's very difficult to track and trace. And to give you an example, because always the pharmaceutical industry is ahead in all the domain, I will say that many drugs on the market were once derived from natural product discovered through bioprospecting that is guided by traditional knowledge from indigenous and people and local communities about medicinal properties of plants and other natural resources. Also about soil, marine environment, and extreme habitat like the hot springs, deep sea vents are explored for microorganisms that produce antibiotic, enzyme, and other bioactive compounds. But the trend right now in pharmaceutical and in many industry is you try by leveraging genetic engineering and synthetic biology, it's possible to produce high value compound more efficiently, sustainably, and consistently. This normally involves the transition from nature-based to engineered microbial production of active constituent. And the first step to do that is to identify the active compound in the plant or animal or microorganisms that have medicinal or commercial value, and to identify the gene responsible for the biosynthesis of this compound in the genetic resource. This also may involve genomic sequences and functional genomic studies to understand the metabolic pathway involved. The genetic resource normally have several active constituents, which normally help the understanding of the structure-activity relationship of the compound and assist the development of more potent chemically related forms. So many products are already on the market and generating huge amount of revenue and profit, but no benefit is shared. I will give you two very simple examples. We all use aspirin. The aspirin was once a drug that has been isolated from the tannin of the willow trees. This was 1828. This is the year where it was extracted. And by 1899, it was sensitized in the form of salicylic acid. And once then, we are using salicylic acid as aspirin and generating a lot of profit. So it has been in the market for more than 100 years, generating profit, and no benefit is shared. Also, if we talk about the cinchona bark, it has been, the quinine has been isolated to treat malaria. Now it has been not used, but we use hydroxychloroquine, which is a more potent derivative from the quinine. And those things has been on the market for hundreds of years. No benefit has been shared. It's important to link the DSI with the traditional knowledge and with the multilateral benefit sharing mechanism under Article 10 of the Nagoya Protocol. This is the way forward, I think.
Yeah,
I
thank
would
you
not
very much for that,
increase.
and thank you for reminding us how complicated this is, and also how much it potentially can contribute to our development. So now that we have secured a commitment to a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, and also to capacity development in the use of DSI, of course, soon we will be moving on to, and we are already engaged in implementing the DSI benefit sharing in Africa. So I want to ask each of you to reflect very briefly, please, 2 minutes each, on which aspects of this DSI implementation would benefit most from a coordinated African approach, and why. Right? And this time we'll start with Jessica, and then take Mpatso, and then Osama, and then Christine will have the last word on that.
I believe it'd be really great if we developed a mechanism or means to facilitate industry contributions and promote and encourage social responsibility. Just this tying into what Osama just mentioned. It was shared in the dialogue that several industries would be willing to contribute financially if given a mechanism, but there isn't one. So it'd be great to establish that in a coordinated fashion across the African continent. On the other end of this, it would also be great if structures and mechanisms for building trust within communities themselves to understand what kinds of benefits would be of most value to them. So really understanding what they need, although that could be more specific and less perhaps coordinated. Another area I think would benefit from a coordinated approach might be going a bit backwards, but as I noted earlier, in generating more DSI, we get more benefits ideally. And so I would like to see a coordinated effort or agreement or whatever it might be to enable countries with limited infrastructure be able to have their genetic resources sequenced at some of the major hubs in Africa, and that the data is shared back without a massive financial burden to the originating country. So bioinformatic training can be part of this. However, issues of overregulation of genetic resources and DSI, and that the fact that there are different regulations between countries will be need to address to make this happen. But I believe these are some areas where a coordinated approach could be useful.
Great, thank you. Bioinformatics was a word I heard very often when we were there. Mpatso?
Thank you very much, Pierre. I'll just add on 2 points to what Jessica just highlighted. One of which would be the issues of capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation, which would benefit a lot if there would be a coordinated approach toward this. And this would be both at global level, regional level, and even at national level. And the second area that would benefit so much is when we are implementing, how do we ensure the mutually supportive implementation of the various ABS instruments? If we have a coordinated approach towards implementation of this mechanism, specifically at national level, it would benefit so much, specifically in how we can reduce the administrative burdens at that level, but also in development of various legislation or supporting instruments to enable the implementation to happen. So I think these 2 areas, the capacity and technical and scientific cooperation, we do need that kind of coordinated approach. And I know that there are already a number of suggestions on the table in terms of seeing how this can be enhanced through already existing mechanisms on the ground, but also how do we ensure, because we saw at the dialogue that you have the treaty issues under the treaty, you have issues under WHO, and so many other ABS instruments being developed, and that at national level, you would need that kind of coordination in terms of implementation to ensure that this is done in a mutually supportive manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think that the general capacity development is very important. Osama, please.
Yeah, in addition to the capacity building, I think it's quite important that Africa continue to speak as one voice. When we have a clear vision on what we want and we speak well as one voice, we can create more impact on the negotiation and head it in the right direction. I think also you need to have a holistic overview and not many of the things has been separated using the sectoral approach. And sometimes when in DSI it does not work, because if you just get the information, you can use it for the pharmaceutical, you can use it for agriculture, and we have seen that many of the sectoral approach are not really generating any benefits. So for accessing resource, but for DSI, I think we can gain back what we have lost and try to have a common approach on how to preserve nature. And also we will need to focus on ethics, because many of the resource information and the resource themselves have been taken prior to the Nagoya Protocol and prior to the CBD even, and they are residing in gene banks. And even most of the African countries wouldn't have access to those genetic resources has been taken. So right now, focusing on ethical issue and need to conserve nature and sustainable use and those kind of stuff, we can generate benefit and put it into that multilateral benefit sharing mechanism to support biodiversity. I think we need to focus that to push developing country and developed country to support biodiversity and work hand in hand so that we have a win-win situation. That's the important things that we need to highlight. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and if there's one thing we should be able to agree in the CBD, it's the importance of looking after biodiversity, right? Christian, please.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre, and thank you, Usama. You finished by talking about the win-win situation. That is something very important, and it's also going back to the capacity building aspect and really highlighting the importance of sustainable, non-monetary benefit sharing in that capacity building program without really affecting or shadowing the monetary benefit that should be coming out from everything that we'll be doing. But it's also very important. I just want to take one example, riding on what Leah said earlier, or what came also from the presentation from Hamad, on the importance of the Agenda 2063 of African Union, for example. And when you look at it, one of the key elements for transformation of the livelihood in general in Africa is about the capacity to adopt and deploy biotechnologies. This requires also the capacity not only to produce DSIs, as mentioned by, I think, Jessica or Martha, but also the capacity to use, producing and using. So that is very important to understand that we need all these capacities, the benefit coming in the form of capacity to use the science, to do the science, to achieve the objective of the Agenda 2063. And one important thing when we are talking about this DSI in the ABS and the CBD is about conservation. How do we ensure that the benefits are really coming back to sustain conservation and make sure that these communities who are being keeping, they have been the real custodian of the biodiversity we are benefiting today. How do we make sure that we are really going back to them with our science and our technologies to support whatever they are doing? So this is very important. And how do we also make sure that the multilateral system is being trickled down, is brought at the lowest level to bring that simplicity in the understanding and the use, as it was mentioned earlier. So for me, this is something important that where I think also we need to focus for the real benefit to come to the right people. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. So while we've been talking, Hartmut and Sahal have been looking at the chat and collecting questions. Guys, is there anything there that you want to pose to the panel for comments and answers?
It seems that quite some questions have already been answered in the chat directly. But I think Suhail and or Hartmut have an issue you wanted to bring up. Suhail?
No, thanks to the panelists having already addressed some of the questions, and but I think one indeed is also an issue that we have discussed in Nairobi quite extensively, and I think it's useful to share some of the reflections on that also here in the webinar. And this is, do we need at least a working definition and scope of DSI for what is negotiated? And I'm referring also back to what some have alluded to already. This is then the question, information and data. Some mentioned already some aspects on that. So as we were quite getting deep on that in Nairobi, maybe that's a point to again put at the and to the panel. So to what extent is it now really useful to have a definition or not?
Thank you, Soho. Who wants to respond to that question about a definition?
Well, I think working on a definition now, it seems like to be wasting time, because what we want to achieve right away is to start generating benefit. And if we continue discussing the definition, we will be losing like 10 or 20 years to try to find something. And with this rapidly evolving area of science is quite problematic. Sometimes on legal issue, some constructive ambiguity will be helpful. And it's used also a strategic key point to assess if you are generating enough benefit. Because, for example, if you work on pharmaceuticals and if you work on genetically engineered organisms and you generate enough benefit to conserve biodiversity, you don't need to go for more complex system for tracking and monitoring and all those kind of stuff. So it depends on the amount of money that you are able to achieve. I think Africa's position to have like 1% of the revenue of all biodiversity related would cover everything, and we will have like easily access and easily monitored system. And in this regard, two important issues that I would like to raise. First is that we need to make more use of the clearinghouses of the CBD, because we already have a database on genetic element and gene under the biosafety clearinghouse. We have a database on bibliographic database of information. And one way is if you are able to build those databases to have more sequence, to have more information, first you will guarantee the open access, and then you will be able also to track how the access has been used. And in addition to that, you can ask the people that will be accessing information to give you a feedback on what they have used. For example, if you have used those sequences or those information to publish scientific publication, why not just to share a summary of the research or the things that you have conducted? It's easier to have it hosted under the CBD to track and follow things and to share information, to share non-monetary benefit. So the clearinghouses are a key role, have a key role to play in this regard. Thank you.
But yeah, and of course, non-monetary, I mean, just having a record of non-monetary benefits would already help. And also like maybe a shopping mall of needed non-monetary benefits. Would anyone else have any thoughts on the question of definition and time wasting and so on? Because I mean, that was part of the thinking behind the African proposal. So if we focus on the products that are sold at retail level, we don't need a definition. The DSI is folded into where it falls in that. Anyone else want to respond to that question? You don't have to, unless you have a burning question, we can take the next one.
I think Osama and yourself have approached it well. We need to look at the bigger picture and not always get lost in the small details. So I think it's well covered.
Thank you. Are there any more, so Hartmut, that you want to put into the pot here, questions?
Well, there is another one that just came up, and I think that maybe more than to the scientists than to the negotiators, and that's that reflection that one of the key monetary benefits as Africa, non-monetary, sorry, would be working towards the development of an own African database for depositing and curating own genetic information deriving from African genetic resources. So is this a value added? How do scientists and I mean, of course, the entire panel see this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm going to ask Christian to respond to that first, because when we visited your lab during the workshop, it was very interesting to me how how much detail was involved in that and how much data must go into doing that work, right? And I was wondering, and I didn't ask you at the time because there were a lot of other people there, but do you put all of that data into publicly accessible databases, or do you keep some of that just in your own research servers? And then in that context, what do you think of the idea of developing African databases? And would those databases be open to scientists from the rest of the world?
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. And as you saw, the process through which we acquire first the sample, generate the data, and store our data, samples and the metadata in our biorepository, but also the DSI in our high-performing computers, etc. So that is something we do internally within ILRI, and of course in collaboration with the other partners, the national system, etc., who can have access. Of course, it is controlled access to the samples and to the data. At any point of time, they can see exactly what they deposited in the biorepository and what they have also. But it should also be known, as I think it came from one of the presentation also, that most donors also and investors, they also require open access to the material and the samples or the output of the research which is supported. So this is to show you what we do internally in our research institution, and how it is there also to support national system. So, for example, what we are doing with the Kenyan Agricultural Livestock Research Organizations and other partners. But it should also be known what is the cost attached to the maintenance of such facilities. I think from Pierre or someone's presentation, from Hamad or someone's presentation, you may have seen the cost of keeping the global database around $50 million a year. Maybe thinking about the Pan-African database, it is good, maybe, and it is important, but do we, for now, immediately, is it what we really need immediately? And do we have the capacity to maintain it, to run it, etc.? And I recall that when we were putting in place the African Biogenome project, the initiative was also to build capacities internally in Africa and to be able to generate data, train the younger generations to use data and develop whatever they want, etc. But quickly, the issue of platforms, critical human resource and capacity to do that is one issue that came, and that prevented us even from sequencing the number of endemic species that we wanted to do from the beginning. So we need to look at things. Of course, that is the global vision. It's good to think about that, but we should have the capacity also to do it efficiently.
But so maybe a bit more of a medium-term ambition that. Okay. Osama, you look like
related to that, Pierre. I think the issue is that you need to prioritize your needs, bearing in mind the little amount of funds that you have. I think our first priority in Africa is to be able to use the sequence to generate benefit and to generate profit. And because if you run after the technology, the technology of having database will become obsolete in 1 or 2 years. You will need to buy new computer. You will need to have security. You will lose a lot of money on using that. And then even if you have the data and you are not able to extract the information or to build product based on that data, it means that you are putting money into something that you're not being able to use. What you need basically is to use the data to generate fund. And once you are done with that, you can think about having database and using part of the fund or the amount of benefits that you are generating to generate more databases and more information to generate more products. But as a first step is that you need to generate something that will build your capacity to build products, to contribute to the process more, to have your companies to improve your economy, basically.
Great. Thank you so much. So the last round of discussion was going to be closing reflections and suggestions on the way forward. And I think you've just given us a very good summary of your closing reflections and suggestions for the way forward. So I'm now going to ask Jessica to do the same, give us some closing reflections and suggestions for the way forward. And then Christian and then Mpatso will get the last word on that closing reflections, suggestions for the way forward. Jessica, please.
Just briefly, given that the dialogue I found was quite informative and inspiring, it would be really great to get some different perspectives in as well from the benefit needs, like what kind of benefits are needed, and really tackle that aspect of things, be it at a national level, Africa level, community level, and just trying to dissect those to really see where we need to go.
Thank you. Christian?
Yeah, the way forward into this is, of course, to look at the recommendation from the first African Science Policy Dialogue and see what we can really build on to advance these problems, and the need for us to be having a common position, supporting the African group of negotiators to be able to put in place good propositions and common proposition during the next COPs that is coming in the next few months. And of course, supporting or bringing on board our national and Pan-African policymakers, etc., to support the initiatives and work with the capacity building, ABS capacity building initiative and other partners to advance the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mpatso, I think from maybe from more of a policy perspective, but please go ahead.
All right. Just final words for me. I think for Africa, we have an opportunity through this discussion. It provides an opportunity for resource mobilization if we make it work. It provides an opportunity for enhancing the capacity that we need if we put in place the good measures that are needed, and also the opportunity to enhance the technical and scientific cooperation, and also for us as Africa to look at this mechanism and see what is the best that we can get out of it. And therefore, we need to continue to work together, push on our common position, and also, like my previous speaker just said, we need all the support we can get from the AU, from NEPAD, from the processes like the ABS Capacity Initiative, so that we are able to find ways of pushing this common position, but also work together in a coordinated way in terms of implementation when it starts to happen. Otherwise, I think let's not get lost in all the tiny details. There'll always be things that need to be figured out, but let's look at the bigger picture and make sure that we get what we have always wanted. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mpatso. Thank you very much, all of you. I'm going to abuse my position here and quickly comment on the question posed by Odette, who asked about the importance of recognizing traditional knowledge when considering benefits from the use of DSI. And say that is exactly why in the African proposal we said that the indigenous people and local communities would be first in line for receiving those benefits. And that was actually also then recognized as a guiding principle in the COP decision. So we are aware of the fact that there's a need to support people on the ground because of their traditional knowledge, but also because of their important role as biodiversity custodians. Thank you again to all of the panelists. Thank you to all the participants. And turn this back over to Katrina, I guess, for the closing session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and thanks everyone for this rich discussion and for your questions and comments and inputs, etc. And this is just to say goodbye from my side, but I will hand over to Hartmut for some final closing remarks for this webinar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Katrin. Well, and as also Pierre started to reply to some of the comments, I would like to first thank all the participants from this event and also for your comments. Of course, we couldn't deal with all comments in the panel round, but what we do, and I think this will specifically relate to comments like from Odette or also from Ganga here, we will really also concentrate on the question, how can IPLCs benefit from this mechanism in the future? What is really the relationship between benefit sharing and open access, and how is associated traditional knowledge related to all the DSI stuff? That is where Osama alluded to. So thanks for all these comments and questions that will enrich our work. I'm going to thank the panelists for their useful and deep insight. Also, of course, all the participants of that dialogue in Nairobi in April. That was a very lively event we had. And of course, we would like to thank ILRI for the excellent hosting and facilities, and also for the visit in their labs, where they could really show us how sequencing is done and how they also support governmental health services with their state-of-art technology. So that was extremely helpful, and also really showing us the level of excellency that is present in this laboratory in Nairobi. Finally, also the African Union Commission, which was co-hosting the webinar. And I think, as you also saw from the recommendations, there is, well, I think there's a lot of requests for further support by the African Union Commission for this policy process, but also in the context of supporting African science and going to fulfill the vision for 2063. Is it? Yes. So this is, I think, one of the many events we are conducting until the COP16 of CBD in Cali, where DSI is again on the table, and where we very much hope that decisions on the future multilateral system for benefit sharing are taken. So stay connected. We will have more webinars on the topic. You will receive invitations for that. The records of this webinar, the presentations, and also a report will be eventually posted on our webpage, which is abs-biotrade.info. There you can find a lot of information. Okay, here we have the webpage. There you'll find all the information also on our past events. With that, I would like to thank all participants here who have joined us in this event today. When you leave it, there will be a short evaluation. We would like to ask you to fill it in. That's important for our project, to show that we also perform and that we serve you in your professional interest. But with that, I'd like to close this webinar, thank everybody again, and hope that we see again in the future to one of our next events. So thanks a lot and goodbye.